Welcome everyone to this first session of our three-part series, Understanding Genocide, the History, Causes, and Responses, led by our esteemed scholar, Dr. Michael Berenbaum. Over the next several weeks, we will embark on a thought-provoking journey exploring the historical origins of genocide, its legal definitions, and key instances in the post-Holocaust era that continue to shape our understanding of this grave human atrocity. Today, we'll begin with the work of Raphael Lemkin, the Polish-Jewish lawyer whose pioneering efforts to define and conceptualize genocide lay the foundation for its international recognition. Through Dr. Michael Berenbaum's expertise, we'll delve into Lemkin's advocacy, the historical context surrounding his groundbreaking work, and how his definition continues to inform our contemporary and legal framework. For those of you that are joining us for the first time, I'm Ellen Resnick, the Educational Programs and Outreach Manager at Classrooms Without Borders. At CWB, we are dedicated to providing immersive, transformative professional development opportunities for educators through unique travel and virtual learning experiences such as this. Over the past decade, we've engaged with over 87,000 participants in more than 600 virtual programs, connecting individuals from across the globe to explore critical issues that open minds and hearts. Your participation and support are essential to our mission. If you'd like to make a contribution to our ongoing efforts, my colleague Jackie Goldblum will drop the link in the chat for you in just a moment. Now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Michael Berenbaum. Michael is a renowned scholar in Holocaust and Genocide Studies, a prolific author and leader in the conceptual development of museums and historical films. His contributions to the field have been profound, including his role as project director of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, executive editor of the Encyclopedia Judaica, and director of the Ziggy Zaring Institute at the American Jewish University. Please feel free to send any questions you have to Michael via the chat. We'll do our best to address them throughout the session. And with that, Michael, the floor is yours.
Okay, first of all, thank you very much for being with us. To those of you who are in Florida, we hope that you're able to keep safe and that your homes and your families, your schools and your community remain as undamaged as humanly possible in this turbulent time. Let's begin by talking a little bit about something quite remarkable when we go into the history of genocide. You know, we're often very frustrated with the question, can one person make a difference? And here we have an example of Raphael Lemkin, of one person without an institutional basis, without personal economic wealth, armed only with his mind and his scholarship and his learning, can dramatically make a difference, transform international law, and bring an awareness of the question of genocide. So whenever we think that the human being, the singular human being, can't make a difference, and we oftentimes have to imagine what it is to really dedicate heart and soul to a cause and make a dramatic difference in the world. So the question becomes, how do we understand who Raphael Lemkin is? And how do we also understand what the concept of genocide is? Before we end today, we will go through the International Genocide Convention and consequently understand the nature of genocide and where genocide comes from. But let's begin by speaking in the broadest terms imaginable. Raphael Lemkin was born in 1900. He died in 1959. He was born in Poland, an area that is now the Ukraine. He worked as a lawyer and became intrigued by the question of, could international law begin to outlaw a crime, what Winston Churchill once called a crime without a name? You know, in medical profession, that one of the things the doctors have to do is to name a disease before they can begin to imagine how they cure a disease. Lemkin's genius of a contribution was to name the crime of genocide, to get it outlawed. And as we're going to see, frustratingly, he was naive in the sense that he thought if he named it and he outlawed it, he could end it. And we don't have the situation in which genocide has ended. We have the situation in which we can articulate and we can misarticulate the word genocide. The word genocide did not exist before Raphael Lemkin invented the term. He combined a Greek word of genus, race, group, with a Latin word, side, which is the murder of a group. And he named the crime with a frightening name, genocide. And today we understand that there is genocide. There's a convention on genocide, and none of this would have happened without Raphael Lemkin, and none of this would have happened without his combination of scholarship and tremendous political activism. And I think of this in a real way because I know many scholars and I know many political activists, and it is the rare person who combines both elements of scholarship and political activism and dedicates his entire life to it. Genus is Greek for family, clan, tribe, race, stock, kin. Side means to kill, the murder of a group, the murder of a clan, the murder of a people in a very dramatic way. Who is Raphael Lemkin? First of all, we have to take a look at, let's just give you a sense of his unique skill. Lemkin spoke 9 languages. He read 14 languages. Now, there's a joke in the United States. What do you call a person who speaks only 1 language? You call that person an American. And the idea that somebody could speak 9 languages and could read 14 languages boggles the imagination, even of somebody like me, who is bilingual in Hebrew and English and can handle Yiddish, German, French, and used to be able to handle Italian. But the idea that somebody was fluent in 9 languages and read 14 is an extraordinary achievement. He was born in 1900 at the turn of the war. He was born in the Russian Empire in what is today Belarus. He grew up in a Polish Jewish family on a farm, one of 3 children, and his father was a farmer, but his mother was a philosophy student, a linguist, and a painter with a large collection of books on literature and history. He had 2 brothers, and he grew up in an environment in which multiple nations, multiple people lived together, multiple languages were spoken, and people lived alongside each other. They got along well enough to live together, though they were not quite intimate, and there wasn't the sense that you have in America of a melting pot in which you all come together and become ultimately American. They lived alongside each other, and consequently, he was sensitive to that from the very age. He was interested in mass atrocities. He was surrounded in a community that had experienced pogroms, that experienced being refugees, that experienced running away, and his family itself had to run away during World War I and had their farm burned and their livestock taken in a very real way in World War I. He graduated from a local trade school, and then he began learning linguistics at Yan Kazimierz University in Lviv, which is now the Ukraine, was then Poland. His first published book was a translation from Hebrew into Polish of the work of Chaim Nachman Bialik. One of Chaim Nachman Bialik novellas, Beyond the Fence, and he gave it the title Noah and Marinka. It was in Bialystok where he became interested in laws against mass atrocities, learning about the Armenian genocide in the Ottoman Empire, and then later experiencing the Assyrian massacres in Iraq during 1933. He became interested in war crimes after experiencing a very interesting moment in history, and also a moment in which what happened in the classroom became absolutely instructive. In 1921, there was the assassination in Germany, and the Turks were allied with Germany, and the Turks who had committed the Armenian genocide escaped to Germany, where they lived freely. One of the Turks, Talat Pasha, who was the main perpetrator of the genocide, was assassinated. And Lemkin asked his professor why Talat Pasha could not have been tried for his crimes. Clearly, he was guilty of crimes. Clearly, he had a role in mass murder. And his professor answered him with a very basic thing, speaking about state sovereignty and the fact that during the time in which the Armenian genocide was committed, no technical violation of law took place. He said, for example, if a farmer kills his chickens in his home, nobody can step in and do that. If you step in to prevent the farmer from killing his livestock or his chickens, you are guilty of trespassing. So it is in state sovereignty. If the laws permit the murder to take place, and the people who administer the laws indeed do commit those murders, then state sovereignty says that only the state can what? Can prosecute them for their crimes. And if the state refuses to prosecute them, there is no prosecution that is available, at least until the moment that was created after World War II, in which there is a sense of international law and a sense of an international crime and a convention on international crime. Lemkin was a great believer in the concept of international law, worked on it at the very beginning. And in fact, during this period of time, he worked during his post-education period, he worked as a deputy prosecutor in Poland, and he wanted to make a presentation to the Legal Council of the League of Nations, convening a conference on international law in Madrid. And he prepared an essay of the crime of barbarity, which was a crime under international law. Polish foreign minister did not permit him as an officer of the government, as an officer of the state, to participate. He surreptitiously had his paper delivered at the conference, and that became his first attempt at public persuasion with regard to the international crimes. He again did not have a word. He called it barbarity and the like. World War II broke out, and Lemkin had a surreptitious journey. I want you to understand the surreptitious journey in a very particular way. And I'm a little bit more sensitive to it this week than I was last week, because I was asked to write a chapter in a forthcoming book on the impact of geography on the Holocaust. If you remember, September 1, 1939 was the invasion by Germany of Poland. And September 17th, you had the invasion by the Soviet Union of Eastern Poland, and Poland was divided along the Bug River. So to the west, it was German, to the east, it was Soviet. And I'm using technical terms because I want to introduce you to a concept that we have to understand, that what is the distinction between German and Nazi? That which is done by the state in the name of the state is German. That was done by the party in the name of its ideology is Nazi. So, for example, there is a German invasion of Poland, German occupation of Poland, but Nazi death camps in German-occupied Poland. The same way we shouldn't confuse Russian with Soviet, and the Russians are part of the Soviet Union. Today they are an independent state, but the Soviet Union, therefore you had Soviet occupation and German occupation. We tend to say those who don't learn from history are condemned to repeat it. And what happened in World War II was that history taught the people the wrong lesson. If you judged by history, during World War I, the Germans were benign occupiers, and the Soviets, the Russians, at that point, it wasn't yet the Soviets, the Russians were difficult occupiers who violated their local population. So if you judged by history, you would want to stay in German-held territories. But if you understood the unique menace of the Nazis, then you would want to leave German-held territories and move to Soviet-held territories, because at least there you did not face an ideology of radical anti-Semitism and ultimately what we would call the anti-Semitism of extermination, annihilation. Now, Lemkin moved to Soviet territories, and therefore he intuited what was happening when the dangers of Nazi Germany. He went to his parents, and you have to admit, you have to think of his last moment with his parents. He begged his parents to leave. He said, I understand what's about to happen. His parents said, we have a farm, we have a family. Your brother lives in the vicinity, our grandchildren are here. We can withstand this, we can outlast it, we can outlive it. Nothing's going to happen to us. And therefore, when he parted with his parents, he understood that this was their last meeting. So you have to imagine the drama of embracing your parents, knowing you will not see them again, knowing that you could not persuade them to leave, and knowing that you have left. He then went to Sweden, where, because of his international law experience, he immediately got a position at the law school in Stockholm, and used this time to research international law. And then, because he had worked with a professor in the United States by the name of McDermott, he came to Duke University in 1941 and began his work there. And he continued to work as a legal scholar. He then moved into the government, was an advisor in a variety of different places. He had essentially worked for the government of the United States and made his home in Washington, D.C. where he became influential and the go-to man on international law. You have to understand that, and some of you have experienced it, that international law was this thin at that point. Some of you have met Ben Ferencz, understand that Ben Ferencz worked for a professor at Harvard who was an expert on international law. And then as a 27-year-old, he became the chief prosecutor of the Einsatzgruppen and of the mobile killing units who operated at the subsequent Nuremberg trials, and brought as a 27-year-old, brought the largest mass murderers in human history to trial, convicting them in 2 days in a trial of documents without witnesses, merely asking them, have you signed this document? Is this your work? Is this your report? And when he totaled up their report, he realized that they had killed in excess of 2 million people and admitted it to it, wrote about it, sent reports back to Berlin about it. But the reason he got his job is he was involved in international law, again, because he was an assistant. In 1944, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace published Axis Rule in Occupied Europe. This book included an extensive legal analysis of German rule in countries occupied by Nazi Germany during the course of World War II. And therefore, Lemkin became the go-to guy on German crimes. And that is that he established his reputation because he was a scholar. He established reputation because he did what had to be done and did it in a way that, in one sense, nobody else had done it. And this is one case in which expertise determined precisely what he would do. He then worked with Robert Jackson, who was the chief prosecutor from the American side at Nuremberg. And when he worked with Robert Jackson, remember that Robert Jackson was using conventional terms: crimes against humanity, crimes against the peace, right? War crimes, and a conspiracy to commit war. This was it. The word genocide was only uttered once, but Lemkin addressed, as it were, and gave a vocabulary to what Winston Churchill had called the crime without a name. He gave it a name that was eerie, a name that was powerful, a name that was poignant. Comes back, he's teaching at Yale University, and he's commuting to the United Nations, then at Lake Success, and trying to get the United Nations, and he finally succeeded in getting the United Nations in December of 1948. In 2 days, the United Nations passed 2 documents that became the foundation, the linchpin, the underwriting for international law and for international standards. The first was the Convention on Genocide, which we're going to see in a moment. And the second was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And remember, when you think of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Universal Declaration of Human Rights included, in passing it, Stalinist Soviet Union. So, but the difference between the two was that the International Convention was a legal document. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was an aspirational document. That is, it didn't put any legal penalties or any legal positions into the violation. It was an aspirational document. This was essentially passed by Stalin in a Stalinist government in the Soviet Union, an American government that had legal discrimination against what? African Americans in the southern states of America had what? Segregation, separate bathrooms, separate fountains for coloreds, for whites, separation of transportation, right? Blacks had to go to the back of the bus, and also legal conventions. What later were declared by the Supreme Court as unenforceable covenants that, for example, did not allow you to sell property to Jews or to African Americans, that were restraints and restrictions on the like. Lemkin transformed scholarship into a lobbying opportunity, and the lobbying opportunity was to get a variety of countries, all of whom to agree that this had to be a crime, this had to be articulated, there had to be penalties, there had to be consequences, etc., etc. He passes this, and then he campaigns to have the United States adopt the International Convention on Genocide, which the United States did not do for 40 years between 1948 and 1988, because the accusation was that the International Convention on Genocide would violate American sovereignty. And only in 1988, under Ronald Reagan and Jesse Helms, and some of you are old enough to remember Jesse Helms, who was one of the last segregationists, under Ronald Reagan and Jesse Helms, only in the fall of 1988, as Ronald Reagan was leaving office, did the United States finally ratify the Genocide Convention. There was a United States Senator by the name of William Proxmire. William Proxmire was the senator from Wisconsin, and every day the United States was in Senate. William Proxmire, until it was ratified, William Proxmire rose and delivered remarks calling for the ratification by the United States of the International Convention on Genocide. In that sense, he was the conscience of the Senate. He gave more than 1,000 speeches advocating the passage of the Convention of Genocide. And fortunate for him and fortunate for us, he lived to see that convention and the like. Let's now read a document together, and then I want to pause and take questions once we read the document. Let me finish the Lemkin story. Lemkin, after all of this, became so consumed with this that he left his teaching position at Yale, lived in New York in a rented room, and died in poverty in 1959 at the age of 59. And there were seven people at his funeral, which gives you a sense of the isolation and also a sense of how monomaniacal he was. And I use that positively, not negatively, how monomaniacal he was about this cause, to which he gave all of his heart, all of his efforts, all of his strength until the waning hours of his life. So in that sense, Lemkin turns out to be an enormously significant hero. And we also have to remember that the Convention of Genocide was not established primarily for the Holocaust, was established combined for the Holocaust and by the way, the Holocaust was not yet called the Holocaust at that point, the Holocaust and the Armenian Genocide, and we're going to see how that becomes pivotal to what we're about to understand. And we are about to see that in a moment. Ellen, it somehow is not allowing me to share screen. If you can make me a co-host, please.
That I am sorry, you should be able to. I'm going to make you the host. You are already a co-host, and I'm going to make you the host. And then Jackie, make sure
Okay.
that you make me
Ladies-
a co-host.
Ladies and gentlemen, let us indicate that Ellen is giving.
You have all the power now.
I have all the power. Not, we're not going to let it go to. Okay, hold on for 1 second. I have to get it. No, the reason is I didn't have the program open, which therefore is the reason I probably could have shared the screen before. Teachers, you know that if you're going to use technology, then well better know how to use it. And someday we will be fully skilled in using it. Let's now go to okay.
Looks good.
Okay, let me just get this so that it functions correctly. Okay. This approved and proposed for signature and ratification, the accession of the General Assembly Resolution 268 of, let me just get this over here, 268 in December 1948, enters into force on the 12th of January 1951, when a number of people are, a number of nations have already ratified it. Having considered the declaration made by the General Assembly of the United Nations, Resolution 96, one dated 11th of December 48, the genocide is a crime unto national law contrary to the spirit and aims of the United Nations, condemned by the civilized war. Recognizing that all the periods of history, genocide has inflicted great losses on humanity, being convinced that in order to liberate mankind from such an odious scourge, international cooperation is required. Herefore, agree as hereafter provided. That in English says we're now about to agree. Contracting parties confirm that genocide, whether committed in time, peace, or war, is a crime unto national law, which they undertake to prevent and to punish. Now we come to the very important element of what's involved with that, and this becomes the definition question. In the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed.
Wow, really?
With the intent to destroy in whole.
Great. I'll see you later. Bye.
Sorry, if you, I apologize, Michael. If you could just make sure that you are muted. We just had someone that was unmuted. Just make sure you're muted. Thanks, Michael.
Now, the word, by the way, in whole or in part, has become enormously controversial in our time. And the reason it's become controversial in our time is precisely because it doesn't say in what part, how much. And therefore, if you kill members of a group, does that mean one? Does that mean 1,000? Does that mean 100,000? Does that mean 1,000,000? Does that mean 6,000,000? Now, the reason for that language, which is here, is because in whole intended to mean the final solution to the Jewish problem, meaning the murder that was the crimes against the Armenians done by the Turks, in which there was never an advocacy for the final solution of the Armenian problem, because Armenians in certain sections of Turkey were safe, and Armenians in other sections of Turkey were targeted. The Armenians in Istanbul, and let's not be charitable for a moment, Istanbul was an international city in which Istanbul, if you know it, is the juxtaposition. It's a city that is part Europe, part Asia. If you go to Istanbul, which is a very beautiful city, you can walk from Europe to Asia by walking across a bridge. You can boat ride from Europe to Asia, and if the water was clean, you could swim from Europe to Asia or from Asia to Europe. So, but the Armenians in Istanbul were safe. The Armenians in the hinterlands and outside of Istanbul were targeted. Killing members of a group, clear. Causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction, or in whole or in part. And that represents for Lemkin what ghettoization was all about. In the period of time during the Holocaust, the ghetto was a place in which Jews did not have adequate resources to live, neither food, nor shelter, nor warmth, nor heat, etc., etc. And the best evidence of that is the death rate in Warsaw in 1941 in the Warsaw Ghetto was 1 in 10. The death rate in 1942, before the deportations of July 23rd, was 2 in 10 within the ghetto without a shot being fired, meaning the conditions were such, etc. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent the birth, to prevent births within that group. And that meant that one of the issues that the Nazis considered deliberately was sterilization. And in fact, there is evidence that they considered sterilization. And the question of sterilization is, why wait? In other words, Jews will die out within a generation if they do not what? Procreate. But why wait? You can get rid of them now. Imposing measures, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. That specifically referred to what you have, which is a very particular moment in the Holocaust, called the Children of Zamość. Zamość is one of the most exquisite and interesting Renaissance city in Poland that looks at it as if you're in a beautiful Italian city. And what they did, the Nazis did in Zamość, was they took the non-Jewish children who had blonde-haired and blue-eyed, who looked like the great Aryans. They took these non-Jewish children, they kidnapped them, and they brought them to Germany to be adopted by German families in order to what? To increase the master race. Now, you have to understand something, and by the way, I want you to understand that we also have examples coming out even today of forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. We just saw that in Canada with the Native American population and the school systems that were designed to Canadianize them, to make them, as it were, white Canadians, and also the killing fields that were there for those who were not successfully Canadianized in that process. Forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. This is also something we see taking place today in contemporary Russia with the war in the Ukraine. The taking of children away and bringing them to Russian families to, as it were, destroy the sense of the Ukrainian people, as it were. Now, I want you to also understand one other thing about the transfer of children, and those of you who are parents will understand this in a very poignant and painful way. If your child dies, in one sense, there is closure. You may never heal, but there's closure. You know the child is dead. You will never see them again. You are struck by loss and enormous pain, grief, and all of that. But now imagine for a moment something radically different. If your child is kidnapped and taken elsewhere, every time somebody knocks at the door, you can imagine that's my child returning home. Even years later, if you are walking around and you see someone who is the age of your child and looks like your child, you can imagine for a moment, maybe that is my child, and no closure is available. And this is an extra measure of what? Of loss without the possibility of closure. Disputes between any contracting party may call upon competent organizations of the United Nations to take such action under the Charter of the United Nations they consider appropriate for the prevention and suppression of acts of genocide and other acts enumerated in the article. In other words, there should be an enforcement mechanism. The enforcement mechanism is what? Is the United Nations, with all the problems of the Security Council and the vetoes, etc. Dispute between the contracting parties related to the interpretation, application, fulfillment of the convention, those relating to the responsibility of the state for genocide, for any other acts enumerated in present, shall be submitted to the International Court of Justice at the request of any of the parties to the dispute. So this establishes a principle of international law and the International Court of Justice. And by the way, Ben Ferencz was the man who argued the first case of the International Court of Justice, deliberately linking Nuremberg to the International Court of Justice, but the United States has never recognized the International Court of Justice, in part because of its violation of the sovereignty of the United States, which is precisely the essential question that Lemkin faced when he began to articulate this. Present convention, of which the Chinese, English, French, Russian, Spanish texts are equally authentic, shall bear, I can't read it because shall bear the date of 9 December 1948. The present convention shall be open until December 31, 1949, for signature on behalf of members of the United Nations, and any non-member state to which the invitation is signed has been addressed by the General Assembly. The present convention shall be ratified, and the instruments of ratification shall be deposited with the Secretary General of the United Nations. After January 1, the convention may be seated on behalf of any member of the United Nations, any non-member state which received the invitation aforesaid. Instruments of ascension shall be deposited with the Secretary General of the United Nations. And then you have the technical language. It shall come in, and then the last element is it shall come into force after its ratification by a series of members. And Lemkin continued to work literally until his dying day, but most importantly, until 1951, to get the ratification in place and to make sure that it came into the fore. Let's take some questions and see where we are at this point and how comprehensible it has been. Let me see if we have questions in the chat. Are there any questions, folks?
We are a small kind of intimate group. You should be able to unmute yourself and ask the questions.
So let's unmute ourselves and ask the questions. I'm going to switch over to a gallery view, so we should be able to see the people.
I'll be the brave first one, Michael.
Thank you, Colleen.
So, in my teaching, I remember learning about Raphael Lemkin from Jerry Fowler when he was at the Holocaust Museum. At what point in your scholarship was this history present? Was it earlier? Was it later? Is it newer? I mean, that's when I first heard it. So I'm just curious when it became a part of the history that you taught.
Well, let me say that I certainly dealt with it in The World Must Know.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly dealt with it in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, because one of the issues you have when you present the Holocaust is, so what?
Mm-hmm.
What comes out of it? And here what comes out of it is a combination. One of the ways in which they've come to terms with it is the legal community came to terms with this by declaring that there is a crime called genocide, defining it as much as you can within the context, with this ambiguity, because in whole or in part is not defined what in part becomes, and consequently you have to do that in the same way that if you are dealing with one of the consequences of what Mengele did and what the doctors of Auschwitz did with the T4 program, the euthanasia program, and the like. One of the very important consequences of that was the decision that was done at Nuremberg, not only to hold the doctors accountable, but to create 10 principles by which the doctors were accountable. And I want you to hear one of the principles, because you see it every single day in every hospital in the United States and in most of the world.
Mm-hmm.
You are entitled, a patient is entitled to informed consent, meaning you must be informed of what is to be done to you, and you have to consent to it. So when I sign a document which says I allow the doctor to operate on me, right, that comes out of the values of Nuremberg. The other element of it with informed consent is a patient may withhold treatment. And some of you, God forbid, have faced this in your own families, What is the moment at the end of life when a patient refuses treatment? And you don't have to take heroic means. Former President Jimmy Carter is on hospice, which means he has said, I've decided to withhold all treatment except to bring me some comfort, but I don't want to undergo medical procedures. If I die, I die. That's a second principle. Every hospital in the United States and every, by the way, university in the United States now has something about human experimentation. And that is that if you have, I have a PhD student who's doing her doctorate, and she wanted to survey a series of people. She needed to go before the ethics board of her university and get permission for human experimentation, quotation marks, and that's not even medical experimentation. So withhold treatment. The other thing is a doctor may not do something that deliberately inflicts pain or injury without the patient's consent. And if you have human experimentation that requires that, the doctor himself or herself must be one of that. So when you come to the question of what are the results, what are the implications, what do we learn, what do we do, I can go through multiple fields. We also have a very interesting thing that is one of the reasons why the West Point and the Naval Academy teach military ethics by having the cadets and the midship persons visit the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, because they learn that, for example, military ethics are restraints on what a military person can do, including the non-defense of I was just following orders. So in that sense, Colleen, it's essential to our study of the Holocaust because it shows the degree to which we learn something and we try to get out of these ashes some ethical principles that bring us to another dimension. Clear?
Thank you. I'm
I have a
always
que-
loving your answers.
I'd
They
like
take
to,
me directions I didn't think of at all. Thank you.
Other questions. Somebody asked me to repeat the difference between German and Nazi. We developed, when you work on both museums and other institutions, you develop a convention as to how you to refer to it, and you want to be accurate and you don't want to be sloppy. You also want to have a position that you take that allows you to defend the position that you take. So our situation is anything done by the state and its instrumentalities is German. Anything done by the Nazi, by the party and its ideology is Nazi. Therefore, there are German laws, there are German occupation. There is the German government, there is German officials. But there is the Nazi death camp in German-occupied Poland. And why do we say German-occupied Poland? Because the Poles legitimately say there were no Nazi death camps in Poland. They were in German-occupied Poland. You can't blame us for that. And consequently, that's a distinction that works, and it's clear and it's coherent. So that's the distinction between Nazi and German. Dan asks a very important question. Should we discuss rape with regard to genocide? Rape is a crime of, rape is number one, a crime, and it's also a crime of war. It's a war crime. And consequently, whether to add it to genocide, the function, and you have to understand, I'm not a lawyer. I'm married to a lawyer, but I'm not a lawyer. And consequently, do not trust me for legal advice or legal definition. but let me try it with that statement. I don't want to say of modesty, I say of accuracy, because there's nothing modest about not understanding the legal precision. Whether you gain anything if you're trying to outlaw crime, if you say it is a crime and it is a war crime, do you gain anything by saying it's an element? Now we say it's an element of genocide. And by the way, rape is an element of genocide. You have to understand something very interesting. In the Nazi universe, the crime of having sexual relations with a Jewish woman was regarded as a crime, and yet they had brothels in which you had sex slaves who were incarcerated in these brothels, and consequently, even though it was a crime, it was regarded as a reward for the soldiers and for the officers who had difficult assignments, and consequently, they had to do something to provide them with a little bit of a reward. Having said that, let me tell a powerful and poignant story that always brings me to tears. There was a rabbi by the name of Arthur Hertzberg, who was a rabbi in Nashville, Tennessee, right after the Holocaust. And two survivors came in to have a conversation with the rabbi in anticipation of their marriage. And the bride asked to stay after her fiance had left. She says, "Rabbi, I can't get married." And she proceeded shockingly to lift her blouse. And he noticed that between her breasts was a tattoo of a Jewish star, an indication that she had been an imprisoned sex slave during the Holocaust, and as a form of fundamental humiliation for the rest of her life. The rabbi said, and he said this was one of the most important moments in his rabbinate, and one of the most deeply personal. He said, not only will you get married, but you must get married. And if you want, I will tell your husband and deal with this with him. And not only that, but I will refer on your marriage document. There's something called the ketubah in Jewish marriage. And in the ketubah, one of the references that you have is betulta, a virgin. And he said, I will deliberately write betulta on your document because you should feel absolutely no guilt for what was done to you. And he recited to his dying years, said this was one of the most important moments of his rabbinate because of what that involved and what that entailed. So rape is a crime. Rape is a crime of war. Rape is a prevalent crime, whether it should be a crime of genocide or not, whether something is added with that, I leave to others to determine. But by the way, saying it's not genocide does not mean it's not awful. And that is that I remember back many years ago in 1982, I attended a meeting of Jewish leaders who had come back from Ethiopia. And they had reported that Jews were that Ethiopian Jews, the Falashas, were being persecuted, they were being starved, they're being humiliated, they were being subject to difficult and painful conditions, discrimination and persecution, but there was no systematic murder. and everybody breathed a sigh of relief. And I, who was then a young man, got up and said, folks, you just were told that people were persecuted, discriminated against, that they were being harmed, they were being maimed, they were being starved, they were being abused, etc., etc. The Holocaust is not a threshold for where crime begins. It is the ultimate crime. And consequently, and that by the way, I reinforce with some of the Israelis who want to call what's happening in what happened to them the Holocaust. It's not the Holocaust. Holocaust occurred over 12 years. It was systematic. It was disciplined. It ultimately involved 22 different countries. Saying something is not a Holocaust or is not the Holocaust or not genocide does not say it's not awful, terrible, important, significant, atrocious, and horrific. It's just saying we need to reserve the word for where it's applicable and how it's applicable. Is that clear, folks? And Margaret has said it very correctly. The crime now has a name, genocide, and the word Raphael and the work of Raphael Lemkin was absolutely indispensable for that. And that's why we honor him. And that's why we herald. By the way, he was nominated several times for the Nobel Peace Prize for his contribution. He did not win it, obviously, but that does not mean he was not worthy of it. Other questions, folks?
Dan, I see you're unmuted. Did you want to ask a question?
Oh, I'm sorry, no.
Oh,
One's enough, I think.
Anybody else? Okay, let me touch on one controversial issue today, which is we hear the word genocide being tossed about with regard to what Israel is doing in Gaza. And I want to specify that what I'm about to say does not mean what has happened to the civilian population in Gaza is not awful, terrible, horrific, and all of that, but it's not genocide. There has been the commission of war crimes, and one of the war crimes that has been committed, which is a structural problem, which is the war crime of putting military facilities in hospital mosques and schools, is itself a war crime. And one of the issues that we will face after this particular awful chapter of the warfare ends is whether indeed one can fight according to just war theory, a just war justly, when the enemy puts the material within mosques, schools, and hospitals and civilian population. That will be a debate and will be articulated over the coming period of time, and let's look at the way in which it's done. Why am I confident in saying that Israel is not committing genocide? Several factors. Number one, Israel has the opportunity to commit genocide. It has the resources to commit genocide. And if it were committing genocide, it is doing a rather awful job in the sense that it has not only the resources and the opportunity, the excuse, and also something significant to gain, which is the expulsion of Palestinians from what some right-wing Israelis regard as the land of Israel. Having said that, it's not committing genocide. One of the elements of that is numbers, and that is that there's a civilian population of 5 million between the West Bank and Gaza of Palestinians. The second is that Israel is doing what we've never seen in the Commission of Genocide, which is it is issuing warnings and dropping leaflets and asking populations to leave and indicating where it's about to bomb and providing successfully and unsuccessfully, and that's a different question, but providing corridors, the humanitarian corridors. And also it's allowing the supplies to come in, and that's a different question from whether the supplies are distributed adequately or accurately in any which way. And part of that is not only due to the Israelis who are to blame because they don't have a plan for what to do once the territory is captured, but also for Hamas, which is now not allowing the equitable distribution of that. So whatever is happening, it is not genocide. That does not mean it's not awful, terrible, and miserable. And there is no doubt also that if the situation were reversed and the power differentiation was changed, that the combination of Hamas, which articulated it in its first charter as the murder of the Jews, now it's the murder of the Zionists, and Hezbollah would not indeed speak and behave in a genocidal language. Now, having said that it's not genocide does not mean it's not problematic, difficult, or anything else. It just means that once you understand the nature of the crime and of the situation, that's not the issue. Is that clear? Other questions? And by the way, let me also say, having said that Israel's not committing genocide, let me also say that the case before the International Criminal Court, the evidence brought for the commission of genocide were statements made by Israeli political leaders, including men who serve in the Israeli government, which says something about the irresponsibility of some of the Israeli national leaders of the far-right coalition and the language they use, but that is not defining the behavior of the Israeli government. And as I'm fond of saying, a couple of paradoxes. Number one of the things we discovered during this terrible period of time is that the people of Israel are better than its government. And I want to then say the other thing, which is only a confirmed anti-Semite could believe that the people of Israel have the leadership they deserve. And only a confirmed anti-Semite and anti-Palestinian could believe that the people of Palestine have the leadership they deserve. And that's one of the tragedies of the current situation. Any other questions, friends, colleagues? If not, Ellen, we're going to do something we've never done before, which is to end a bit early.
Wow.
Next week, we will go through the different stages of genocide and the work of Raphael Lemkin, the work of Gregory Stanton, and the articulation of what genocide means, and we will see that. And I want you to become comfortable with this language and comfortable with all of its implications. And I hope we achieve that today. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And just a quick correction, our next session is on October 30th. So not next week, but in a couple weeks. I will formally bring us to a close for our first session. Of course, as always, I want to extend my gratitude to Michael for this enlightening presentation on Lemkin and the origins of the word genocide. As always, his insight has offered us profound understanding of how one's individual relentless pursuit of justice shaped international law and the way we conceptualize and address the atrocities of genocide. Thank you all for your thoughtful participation and your questions today. Your engagement is what makes this learning experience truly impactful. As we continue this series, we encourage you to reflect on the concepts discussed and how they resonate with today's global challenges. Our next session, as I mentioned, is on October 30th. Once again, thank you all for being part of this important dialogue. And as Yom Kippur draws near, may this day of reflection and atonement bring you peace, and may that peace extend to our world. Bye, everyone.